look at all this human activity. People going about their business here in central London. But hidden amongst the crowd is a very different kind of human traffic. Refugee children missing in the UK. The National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children has revealed that traffickers have drugged and sexually abused children as young as 11 after promising to bring them in from France and the refugee camps there. It's tempting for those living in poor shelters with contaminated drinking water to accept such offers of relocation to Britain. The children are among hundreds of displaced people who continue to live in terrible conditions near the border in Calais and Dunkirk, in situations that the UN recently described as inhumane. And so they get to the UK, and in many cases go missing. The NSPCC's Child Trafficking Advice Centre has been working with the Refugee Youth Service, a Calais-based charity, to locate the missing children in the UK. It has so far located 68 of them, but 128 remain missing. Children as young as 9 have been taken into the UK without their parents' knowledge, and they have disappeared from refugee camps. The NSPCC has called on the UK to take additional steps with France to address the problem. They say countries have a legal duty to protect child victims and insist that those protections must remain after Brexit. Because there are so few safe and legal routes for child refugees, they end up in great danger, seeking ways to enter the United Kingdom from France, often risking everything for the prospect of a better life and a safer one in another country. What would it feel like to be separated from your family as a result of your circumstances as a refugee? And should the UK accept more refugees from conflict zones? Simple questions with important answers. Let's start with this. Is the British public aware that more than 120 child refugees trafficked to the UK have gone missing? What are the public's thoughts on this? We asked them. This is what they said.
I think the migration is a problem at the moment, and particularly what we choose to report and what we don't choose to report. And I think that sometimes if it's a little bit less sexy, we kind of ignore it and shove it to one side and focus on something a little bit more dramatic as a bit of a headline hitter. And I think that's terrible.
The 120 kids are missing because they're children, that's someone's daughter, someone's son from somewhere. So yeah, horrific.
That's shocking, isn't it? When you think about the fact that we have social services set up, you'd think that we have the right people in this country to deal with that kind of situation.
I don't really know. I suppose I kind of feel a bit emotionless to it because I don't know about the stories behind the people that have been trafficked in. So I can't really think of that mindset of how of the journey they would have gone through to.
Yes, I have heard about that, and I've seen it a lot on Twitter, and I think it's absolutely terrible. But I think that a lot of people are spreading the word about this just because I've heard it a lot through social media, and I think it's really terrible.
I think the way that the UK government kind of disregards things like that is just ridiculous, and the kind of it's brushed under the carpet by the looks of it, and when it does come out, it seems to be blamed on other areas which don't really cover or give any answers to the questions that people have.
I think it's a bad thing to hear about child trafficking, and particularly the fact that they got missing in a country as advanced as United Kingdom. It's a terrible thing to hear about that. I think government needs to look into these statistics and ensure that all individuals who are responsible for this act of callousness needs to be prosecuted.
It's really, really sad, and I think it's something that we can actually do something about. Obviously, populations, we have so much more power than we realise, but we just need to be organised. We just need the right leaders in place and people who are genuine, people who really care, people who are trustworthy. Because obviously there have been loads of situations where people in power have abused that power and taken funds and not done the right things with it.
I didn't know the exact numbers, but I was aware that that is an issue. Personally, if the number was 1, that's bad enough. 120 is not a good number.
I wasn't actually aware that 120 child refugees had gone missing. Now that I know, I'm actually not surprised at all. We saw with the Windrush generation that the government has failed when it comes to vulnerable communities, and one of the reasons it has failed is because of the culture of hostility that's created by Theresa May and the current government for the last decade or so. And this hostility is playing out in so many areas, whether it be the Windrush generation or refugees who are one of the most vulnerable communities. So I expect to see more and more cases where we are seeing refugees being denied their basic rights.
Yes, I am aware, and frankly, it's surprising that many of the great British public are not aware of the fact that so many refugee children have gone missing into the ether. These are vulnerable children who could be now subject to criminal exploitation, slavery, sexual exploitation here in the United Kingdom, and really ought to be a #1 priority for the Commissioner of Police and the Home Secretary. How can so many children completely disappear into British society without any trace or anybody holding responsibility for them? So I am aware it's a desperately worrying situation, and we're hoping that the government and the police really focus in and get a grip on what could be potentially a very, very dangerous situation.
Traffickers have drugged and sexually abused children as young as 11 after promising to bring them into the United Kingdom. How can we prevent this from happening? We asked the public.
We looked at the problem at source and looked at how we could rectify either internal conflicts, civil wars, political regimes that possibly shouldn't be in power or need to be heavily sanctioned to be more in line with what we believe to be morally acceptable. I think actually we'd solve the problem a lot quicker rather than how do we stop the boats coming over. It's actually more about how do we stop the people from wanting to get on the boat.
I think the problem initially comes from the countries where the refugees are coming from. I think that's where the initial problem is, but the fact that kids are getting trafficked is terrible, horrific.
I think that if the public are more aware of the ways in which children are trafficked and look out for those things, then maybe we can all do something about it, I guess.
Borders can be a very hard thing to control without lengthy border controls that could delay quite a lot of things about import and export.
By keeping the families together, I feel like is the most obvious answer to that one, but I don't know how that would work logically.
Tightening up the laws and making it more obvious the punishments that people get, so making obvious that this won't be tolerated and it won't be allowed, and actually focusing on the areas and cutting out the corruption around those areas would be a place to start.
Statistic I was aware of was the 3,000 unaccompanied children that the government have decided not to let into the country, which for me is absolute I don't know what the word would be, epitome of evil, to be honest.
We need to have better control in terms of when people are coming into our country. We've got to have a better system of getting them into the right care systems, of providing safe places for them.
At the very minimum, we need to have robust mechanisms. We need to have fundings in place so that the organisations that are looking after refugees are not denied the funds. We need a change in narrative. We cannot continue to see refugees as enemies, which has been the case for many, many years. Refugees are not enemies, they are fleeing from persecution. And I think we need to also have, make it possible for refugees to come in a legal way. If we don't, then what we are doing, if we make it impossible, we are empowering the traffickers, which means we are enabling more abuse of children, more abuse of refugees. So we have to make sure there are proper ways for refugees to come legally without having to go through traffickers in the way it's happened recently.
I think it's vitally important that there is a complete register of refugee children with who their responsible adults are. I don't think it's sufficient for children to be brought into the United Kingdom and then handed over to whomsoever claims to be their relative or their responsible adult. I think all children should be tracked. I think they should be put on a register as being vulnerable. They've come from very difficult situations, often where war or famine or family breakup are concerned. and they need to ensure that their mental health and their well-being is something that is prioritised and looked into. And you can't do that by simply opening your doors and saying, well, you're now in a free country, go about your business. So I think it's vitally important that the government has a register of all vulnerable refugee children, and seeks to ensure that the same safeguarding principles that apply to British children are applied to refugee children.
The UN criticised the strikingly high numbers of refugees detained in Britain, up to 13,000 last year. We invited the public to describe how they might feel if, while seeking refuge abroad, they were detained and separated from their family for an indefinite time.
How would any father feel being taken away from his children? I mean, you'd feel injustice, you'd be looking for sanctity, and you'd be looking for almost peace in your soul, and then all of a sudden your family's ripped apart. I mean, it would be devastating for any father.
Something wrong with the system by the sounds of that. Like I said, I didn't know, you didn't know previously, but it's horrific.
I'm remote, so I'm sort of vaguely familiar with the issues. Being from Australia, we have had this issue in the media for a long time, with detention camps being compared to concentration camps, with lack of access to justices that most of us have access to.
It depends on the wider picture of which situation you're in, and I'm sure if you're in a relatively stronger place of you're going to get out of this detained camp, that you could imagine bringing your family back together and working towards that goal.
It would be terrible. I can't. I'm really close with my family, and if I were ever separated from them, especially in a foreign country,
It'd be horrible. I can't imagine what those people are going through, and the way that the UK government doesn't assist is, I think, needless. Obviously, there needs to be rules and there needs to be regulations towards it, but at the same time, I think, if people are in dire need and it's actual real need, then they need to be assisted as much as they can, and we have the resources to do it.
I think one of the most shameful things that this country has is the detention centres where not just adults but children are detained, and not with any kind of clarity as to what their situation is, but with complete indefinite kind of sentence, really.
Especially if you don't speak the language and you are a kid, how are you going to provide for yourself? How are you going to look after yourself? You're trusting, you've always relied on other people and your family to look after you, and suddenly you're all on your own. It'd be terrifying.
We live in a privileged society. I mean, I cannot imagine how I would feel. It's quite difficult, but we can at least empathise, and the least we would expect is to be treated as human beings, given our basic rights, and not be treated as terrorists and subhumans. That's the least we can expect. And if I had a family in a refugee camp, I would expect the families to stay together. As a policy, it makes no sense to separate families, because a family is one of the protections you can have against traffickers, against any kind of abuse. So if you keep the family refugees together, then you protect them from abuses, from traffickers, and other kind of abuses that refugees face throughout Europe.
As a country that is supposedly championing human rights and compassionate justice around the world, to be seen now to be so hostile to refugees and refugee children, I think is a condemnation of the United Kingdom government, and one in which reveals the true character of Brexit Britain, if I can use that term. One where xenophobia, where religious discrimination, where a lack of compassion for the vulnerable characterises what is today 21st century Brexit Britain.
In July 2017, 104 child refugees trafficked to the UK from northern France went missing. By June 2018, the number stood at 120. The UK government has pledged to receive 20,000 Syrians and 3,000 vulnerable child migrants by 2020. There were about 123,000 refugees and 45,870 asylum seekers in the UK by the end of 2015. Worldwide, people who have fled to other countries as refugees has exceeded 22.5 million in number. More than half of these are children. The United Nations Refugee Agency has urged Britain's next government to do the right thing by accepting refugees and resettling more people from conflict-torn regions. Does the public agree, and why?
Nobody wants to be taken from their home. It's not the UN place to say you've got to help settle them. We should help settle them temporarily to help them get them back to their own homes, their own families, their own heritage.
In terms of bringing more in, welcome them with open arms. But, however, there does need to be a good system in place. I mean, you said that earlier that 120 kids have gone missing. There needs to be a good system, and you can't split families up. There's got to be secure, safe housing for these families.
I think that you would probably find that there's a lot of opposition among the populace, but I personally believe that we should, and I think it's possible, and I think we just need to have the right taxation, and we just all need to be more humane. End of story.
It's a good thing to rehome people and bring them into new countries and support that, because actually it could be a bigger benefit to the country bringing them in than people realise. People are very negative towards it, and it shouldn't necessarily be, but it's about the right support for those refugees coming into the country.
I think I do agree with that, because these people are in serious distress with their lives and they really need help, and I think as a world we need to come together and help them.
I do agree, because at the end of the day, again, people moan about immigration, they have issues with it, but I think it's a human rights issue, and I think it's just a basic need that people should be able to live as good a life as they can, and if you have the resources to do that, then you should offer as much as you can.
I totally agree with that, because the United Kingdom is one of the great countries in Europe, and they've been responsible for a lot of charity across the world. Not only that, they have also been involved in a lot of what I call colonization of most of the African countries as well.
I think we need to look at what resources we have. I think obviously it's really important that we address the issues that are current in the country as well. And it's all about finding that balance, because obviously if you take on too much, it's just like in your personal life. If you take on too much and you don't look after yourself, you're no good to anyone else. So it's about looking at what resources we have, how can we help, how can we take resources from areas that maybe they're not needed.
I think we have to think about, or put ourselves in those people's shoes and think about what they've been through. The fact that they've, some of them have been trafficked in extremely difficult circumstances to get just to the borders of the UK is almost a life adventure in itself. To then decide, no, we don't want them because actually we don't like the colour of their skin, and let's be honest, that's what it's about. It's not about anything else. Is ludicrous and shameful.
I agree, because I think we need a more compassionate government. We need to recognise our responsibilities, and we need to recognise the fact that we have been directly responsible for the creation of the refugee crisis. And it's quite shameful for this country to be dragging its feet when countries like Turkey have allowed 2.5 million refugees, and this country is not even, is struggling to accommodate 10,000 refugees. And as I said, this all plays into this hostile environment that's been created by the media, by our government, by seeing foreigners, especially from the Middle East, as terrorists, as subhumans, and that's something that needs to be dealt with. And I think we should have a change in government which is more compassionate to foreigners.
I think it's absolutely essential that Britain recovers its moral integrity in the world by seeking to be doing the right thing by international refugees. Part of the displacement, global displacement of refugees is largely because of Western intervention, of which United Kingdom is usually part, whether that's in the Middle East, whether that's in Yemen, whether that's in other places around the world. So the huge displacement of refugees across the globe means that Western countries ought to be the first ones to be offering sanctuary and comfort to them. Far from that, we see that not only are Western countries wanting to intervene ineffectively in foreign countries, but they're then refusing to pick up the tab when refugees are fundamentally displaced from their homes and villages. This is an abrogation of Britain's historic role of being a country of refugee and asylum, and the sooner the government and a new government begins to restore our integrity as being a nation that is compassionate and just, the better.
Most refugees are from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen and South Sudan. The UK has been involved in each of these wars by either profiting from arms sales or actively deploying military resources. Does this put the UK under a moral obligation to protect those fleeing conflict? The public said this.
I don't think that we as Englishmen and as members of the Great Britain have an obligation. I think we as humans have an obligation to do morally the right thing, and no man is free until all men are free. and that was enough to spark a civil war with Abraham Lincoln. So it should be, even today, it should still stand true.
It's partly our doing, so we've got to pick up the pieces as well. 100% completely agree with that.
I think the problem is that we wash our hands of that because it's far away. We've never experienced that level of suffering.
War is about money at the end of the day, and if we benefit from a war, which we quite rightly do, we need to benefit and bring those people back into and support the countries we destroy.
I think they do, because if they're involved in everything, then they should have an obligation to protect the humanity of the people who are involved.
We're involved in it in one way or another, and if you go into a country going in to take actions of war in countries are often billed under the banner of going to assist its citizens. So if we're doing that, we should then have the responsibility to help them all the way through.
United Kingdom, who sell weapons to most of these war-torn countries, I think there is a moral obligation for them to take more refugees, particularly children.
I think there's a tricky balance between looking after yourself and then bringing yourself to a state of health within the country so that you can then look after other places and other people from coming in.
What they did in Iraq was complete folly, in the sense that they had absolutely zero plans for what to do afterwards. And some of the decisions they made, like disbanding the Ba'ath Party, which actually ran the country and therefore the infrastructure, left a vacuum that allowed other people to walk into. So are there consequences that could have been avoided by the actions taken by the Western nations? Absolutely there are.
I think it's a general moral principle. You know, if you are responsible to the extent you have caused the problem in the first place. So that goes without saying. This country has a moral obligation, but not only that, it has a legal obligation as well. It has a legal obligation under the United Nations Refugee Convention, which this country is a signatory to, and is also a signatory to the protection of the child. So not only does it have to just provide, security for refugees and make sure their rights are protected, but also children refugees, make sure that they have the right agencies in place so that children do not fall prey to traffickers. That's also something, as a signatory to these conventions, the UK, France and other European countries have to make sure.
I think there's absolutely no doubt there's a moral imperative for Britain to be responding to the needs of the refugees. We profit in the billions from selling arms to any side in a war. In that sense, we're an equal opportunities arms supplier. We'll sell to both sides in any war. But it's a despicable moral position that, having profited from the pain and the grief and the war and suffering inflicted on others, that then we should then to shut the door, turn our backs and forget about thousands of refugees, whether they're coming through from Libya and drowning in the Mediterranean, whether they're seeking sanctuary from the war-torn provinces of Syria or the Saudi bombings in Yemen. Britain has a moral imperative, a moral compulsion to be able to respond. I'm hoping that in the next few years, any new government that comes to the United Kingdom will have this as its very heart, restoring Britain's international reputation as a country of safe haven for refugees.
Theresa May, who oversaw immigration policy in the Home Office for 6 years, has doubled down on the Conservative pledge to cut net migration. We do want to bring net migration down to sustainable levels. We believe that is the tens of thousands, the Prime Minister told reporters. She went on to say, when we leave the European Union, we will have the opportunity to make sure we have control of our borders. Leaving the EU means we won't have free movement as it has been in the past. Britain has been invited to honour its own rich history of welcoming those forced to flee conflict. Instead, the British government talks of maintaining barriers and having no time limit on immigration detention. To many, this is not just negligence by the UK government towards refugees, especially child refugees who can then simply disappear. It also amounts to a failure to address a refugee crisis which the UK itself has helped cause by sponsoring or even profiting from the very wars which provoked this massive migrant crisis.